Okay, so let's start. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Applied Development Economics Seminar Series. I hope everyone is well and had a good week. We are very excited to have Dr. David Evans with us today. Dr. Evans is a senior fellow at the Center for Global Development. Previously, he was lead economist in the Chief Economist Office for Africa region at the World Bank. He has designed and implemented impact evaluations in agriculture, education, health and social protection in Brazil, Gambia, Jamaica, Kenya, Mexico, Sierra Leone, amongst others. Of course, many of us are also avid readers of blog posts and policy briefs, which are an amazing public resource for development economists. Before I ask Dr. Evans to start his presentation, let me quickly go over the house rules, which are also on the slides in front of you. Dr. Evans will have 40 minutes for his presentation. If you have any questions while he is presenting, please post them in the Q&A function in Zoom. We will try to stop in between to answer any clarification questions. We will also have a 15-minute Q&A session towards the end of the seminar. During the Q&A session, please feel free to continue posting questions in the Q&A function. You can also use the raise hand function at this time to indicate that you have a question, and then you will be asked to unmute and ask your question live. And with this, I'll welcome Dr. Evans again and invite him to start his presentation.
Thank you so much. It is a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for the invitation. I'm excited to talk with you today about girls' education, looking back and looking forward. So I'm going to talk today about two papers, which I've written with a set of fabulous co-authors. So the first paper is Gender Gaps in Education, The Long View, with Miriam Akmal and Pam Jakila, both colleagues here at the Center for Global Development. And the other, What We Learn About Girls' Education from Interventions That Do Not Focus on Girls, which I wrote together with my colleague Fei Yuan. So to start, essentially the first paper will give us a sense of the long view historically, where we've come from in terms of girls' education. And the second paper looks at right now, what do we know about the best interventions to improve girls' education? Now, girls' education has been trumpeted by researchers and policymakers and even celebrities and others as one of the best investments in children's in development. Now, the question at the same time is we still see gender gaps in education. So where have those come from and why? So in Gender Gaps in Education, the long view, we look at data from around the world over the last 50 years to establish a few big facts about girls' education. So the data we use is the Barrow-Lee Education Attainment Data Set. Now, this has educational attainment data, so how much education people get for the adult population, 15 plus, for 146 countries in the world from 1950 to 2010 by age and by gender. We focus on data for 126 countries, so all the countries that were not founding members of the OECD, so countries that hadn't already gone through a full education transition by the beginning of the data set. From 1960 to 2010, we look at the gender gap, which we define as the average educational attainment for women minus the average educational attainment for men. So over the course of this presentation, you'll see when you see a negative number, that means women have less education than men. If you see a positive number, that means women have more education than men. So a couple of things to keep in mind. One is that because we're interested in the long view and how societies are evolving over time, we're focusing on all women, age 15 plus. So obviously that takes longer to change than just the recent cohorts. So there's some societies where in recent years they've made a lot of progress on girls' education, but we still don't see that necessarily in the data because you've got a lot of adults who still don't have that much education. And we do some separate analysis that looks just at the youngest cohorts, age 20 to 24. And I'll just tell you right now, we see very similar patterns with a couple of exceptions that I'll highlight. Okay, the first big broad fact that we find, unsurprising, hopefully to anyone on this call, is that women are more educated today than at any point in history. So we can see this from this figure. This shows the distribution of average years of education across countries in 1960 in the lighter left-hand mountain, and in 2010 in the right-hand darker mountain or distribution. And what you can see is that the mountain has moved. So, women's education has shifted dramatically from an average of less than 2 years of education in 1960 to an average of between 6 and 8 years of education in 2010. So globally, it's a big shift. Now, if we look country by country, we also see this same pattern virtually everywhere in the world. So what we see here is on the vertical axis, years of schooling for women age 15 plus, and on the horizontal axis, years of education for men age 15 plus. And what you can see is that in virtually every country, the arrows go from 1960 at the bottom of the arrow to 2010 at the top. In virtually every arrow, these are pointed upwards. So women's education is increasing. The biggest gain in our sample is in the United Arab Emirates, and even the smallest gain in Senegal, we see a significant rise, almost a doubling of female educational attainment. Senegal is one of these countries where if you looked at the age 20 to 24 cohort, you'd see a much bigger gain in women's education. But those are relatively recent gains, which is why they don't entirely come up in this full population. So if we separate these data out region by region, we see the same pattern in every region of the world: East Asia and the Pacific, Europe and Central Asia, Latin America and the Caribbean. We see in every region of the world, countries are rising, both in terms of their female education and their male education. So we don't have Pakistan singled out here because on each figure we show the biggest improver and the smallest improver, and Pakistan is neither of those. But in our data, we have that in Pakistan, women's education was an average of 0.35 years in 1960, up to 3.76 years in 2010, whereas men's education went from about 1.5 years to 6.25 years. And so just like every other country in our sample, we see sizable increases for women, sizable increases for men. Okay, so that's the good news, is that women are more educated now than they've ever been before. Some of the bad news is that women are still not as educated as men, again, in virtually every region of the world. So in this figure, we show the gap, women's education minus men's education. So a 0 would be parity in education, equality in education. And you can see that across the entire, all the blue lines show countries where gaps narrowed or improved over time. The orange lines show where gaps actually worsened over time. And then the thick black line in the middle is the median. So the median across countries has improved, absolutely, but it's still, in 2010, you can see that the median is still far below 0. And again, if we look country by country, we see similar patterns. The one exception here, you can see that in Latin America and the Caribbean, countries are almost at 0. In Europe and Central Asia, the median is almost at 0 by 2010. But in every other region of the world, the gap is still well below 0. Okay, so that's some bad news. The second piece of bad news, so our third fact, is that gender gaps have often gotten worse before they've gotten better. And so we see this across all the countries in our sample. We see this in 76% of our sample. So in more than 3/4 of the countries in our sample, the gender gap has actually gotten worse. We started improving. And you can see region by region what this looks like. You can see the places that were hardest hit in this regard are South Asia. So the blue dashed line near the bottom, the gap was just -1 year in 1960. And then by 2005, that gap was almost -2 years. And then by 2010, things started improving again. It's not unique to South Asia, though. In Middle East and North Africa, the gap also widened just through 1970 and then started improving. In sub-Saharan Africa, the gap widened and then started improving in the mid-80s. And so in each region, many places, the gender gap actually has gotten worse before it started to improve. So in this map, we show where it was at its worst, in history in each country in the world. And so you can see in many African countries, it's quite recent. The darker the orange, the more recent the time is. You can see Pakistan there was at its widest gender gap in 2005, along with India and a few other countries in the region, along with several countries in Africa and a few countries in Latin America as well. Some countries in Latin America, so Brazil, Argentina, have actually been improving their gender gaps consistently since 1960. And in fact, many of those countries have actually crossed the line. Even though the region as a whole of Latin America hasn't crossed the line, several countries in Latin America have crossed the line where you actually have more education for women on average than for men. So when we look at where things got worse before they got better, this mostly happened in countries where in 1960, both boys and girls had relatively little schooling. So if you look at this figure, what we can see is the change in the gender gap in schooling over time on the vertical axis, and then on the left, female years of schooling, on the right, male years of schooling. And you can see countries where that change has been negative, so where the change on the vertical axis is below 0, you can see that those countries are mostly concentrated on the left side of the figure. So what this means is that these are countries where virtually everyone had very little education in 1960. So what households and countries as a whole tended to do was, as they started to expand their education systems, first invest in education for boys. And so initially there was very little gap because there was very little education for boys or girls. And then countries and households would invest in boys' education. And so you'd see the gap widen. And then as countries grew wealthier and education for boys grew more universal, countries would expand education for girls. That's what we observe happening over time in many countries. So I started with some good news, some bad news, some more bad news, and then I'll end talking about this paper with a little bit more good news, which is that gender gaps rarely persist in educated countries. So in countries where, for example, you see high levels of education for men, it's very rare that high levels of education for women persist. So in this plot, what we show is where countries went to from 1960 to 2010. And so you can see the dark blue at the top shows countries in 1960 that had high education and small gender gaps. There were just 5 of those countries in 1960. By the time we get to 2010, there were, you can see that, the countries that, in 1960, down at the bottom of the figure, there were 50 countries that had low education and a large gender gap. And they're half that number in 2010. Just 25 countries with low education and low gender gap. So what you see on the right is that the number of countries that have a high education and a large gender gap is very small, just 5 countries. So it's very rare to be a high education country with a large gender gap. And for what it's worth, those countries, so countries like the Republic of Korea, are countries where both girls and boys are getting more than 10 years of education on average. And so in this figure, we're defining a high education as countries where men have at least 8 years of education, and a large gender gap as a gap of at least 1 year. And so, the high education countries with large gender gaps are countries where both women and men on average have pretty high levels of education. And they are very few. So as countries become high education countries, girls tend to catch up. So in the figure on the left, what we can see is the number of high education countries over time from 1960 to 2010, and the number of countries with high education and a large gender gap, so a gender gap of at least a year, the number has remained roughly constant. So the countries that go in and out of that group change over time. A lot of countries initially, reach high levels of education for boys, and then, after a little bit of time, their women catch up, and they shift into those blue bars. So if you look on the right, what you can see is this pattern playing out in individual countries. And so, this is most clear, for example, in Ghana And in Iraq, if the blue dots are male schooling, and the orange dots are male schooling, and the blue dots are female schooling. And you can see in Ghana, for example, on the top right, that schooling years increased initially for boys. So we see that gap widening, but then it catches up. It really starts catching up and narrowing. And in each of these countries, we see that gap narrowing as the level of education rises. So this is the good news, and the thing that countries around the world can really look forward to. That girls' education does tend to catch up. The other thing that we see is that low education countries with high gaps tend to have multiple problems. So this isn't just an education problem. So for example, if you look at the high education countries with large gaps, Bolivia, Ghana, Iraq, South Korea, and Tunisia. If you look at the low education with large gaps, many of those countries, so the countries in red are countries that are fragile or conflict affected. Countries with an asterisk are countries that were formerly fragile or conflict affected. And then many of these countries, not pockets, are countries that are in the bottom quartile of all countries for infant mortality rates and GDP per capita, that have low transparency indices. And so these tend to be countries that have lots of challenges together, which is to say that countries that have low levels of education for everyone and large gender gaps probably need a lot of investments, not just investments in girls' education. So what about learning? So far, we've just been talking about access, and we all care. There are women being in school, but as we know, learning is very important. We've seen good evidence that the association between economic growth and education is largely driven by gains in learning. Now, measuring learning gaps is actually not totally straightforward. So if you imagine, for example, here we have in red, if we imagine the distribution of women in red and the distribution of men in blue, and if you imagine, okay, well, let's give everybody a test and measure the test score, and we find on average that they learn about the same. Now, the trick, of course, is that if you don't have similar enrollment in school and you give a test to kids in school, which is how most tests are given, then you might not get an accurate representation. So for example, in this example that I give, in blue, if we have all the boys in school and we give a test, then we have a sense on average of what a boys' test scores are. If we don't have all the girls in school, so if the two girls on the left are out of school, and we just measure the average score for the girls that are in school, then we might actually observe higher test scores for girls, not because girls on average are actually learning more, but because the highest performing girls are the girls who tend to be in school. And this is just an example. So, we don't have great data on girls that are out of school, but it does make it difficult to interpret some of the differences that are observed in the data. So for example, in Latin America, a big report from UNESCO showed that girls lead in reading, they lag in mathematics and science. A recent study on countries across Africa showed that girls lag behind in mathematics. Now again, because we don't, in most of these countries, relation of men than we are women and things. We've done some initial analysis of test scores across countries, in a few countries in East Africa where they have population-based measures, not school-based measures. And we do find it seems like there's some definite selectivity in which girls are in school. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say about the kind of the big trends historically. And I don't know, Farah, if you want to take a moment for any clarifying questions before we jump into this.
Sure, there are a couple. So Fatma Abbas is asking if you know of the determinants of turning points that decides when countries will shift from a worse gender gap to a better one, and if there are any determinants of the pace of that change.
That's a great question. Inside, so we've just gotten a revise, and we submitted this paper to a journal, and we got to revise and resubmit, and that's exactly what Our referee said, so you're in good company, said, so what are the, why do you have this turning point? So this is something we're looking into right now. How much of this is a decision that countries in a different place politically in terms of women's suffrage, so right to vote, women's economic access. And things that is striking is that it varies dramatically across regions, as we saw in the figure, right? And so a much later in income, in Latin America, the shift. So it seems like it must have in the economy. That's still a work in progress. I heard that, and in some so, but anecdotally, it's certainly the narrative that people share.
And just one more question before, I think we'll keep the rest for the end, but one more question which is related to this is if you think the gender of the teachers also plays a role in girls' education?
So this is also a great question. So we didn't examine this in this study, but Alexis Lenestor and I did a small review of female teachers and what we find there. We don't see we couldn't find a single study that looks at the impact of the proportion of women on the teaching force on access to schooling. So one of you wants to write that study, I encourage you to do it. We certainly heard anecdotes, and this is again, some from colleagues who work in Pakistan specifically mentioned that that lots of families were more comfortable sending their girls to school with female teachers. We do see some evidence, some suggestive evidence. It's not super strong across countries, but we do see some evidence that that girls get higher test scores from female teachers, and maybe that boys also get higher test scores from female teachers. We also find, interestingly, some data that finds that physical physical punishment it tends to be roughly even across the genders. So that data is mostly from Africa. I suspect this will vary a lot across regions, various sort of cultural norms. But in various African countries, a lot of people going into our work imagined that, for example, female teachers would be less likely to, have, physical punishment of kids in schools. We don't find that in the data. We actually find that in East Africa and West Africa, that women are just as likely to inflict, physical punishments on kids. One of the other concerns that people bring up is sexual abuse of students. And sorry, I know that's a sensitive topic, but it's also important. That's something where the intuition that a lot of people have, of course, is that female teachers are less likely to engage in that. Anecdotally, that certainly seems plausible. There just aren't good systematic data on sexual abuse in schools. And so, it's obviously a difficult thing to gather data on. And so we just don't have a good empirical basis for that. So. Okay, well, thank you for those, and I'll jump into the next paper, and then I look forward to engaging more questions towards the end. So now I'm going to talk about this work that I did with Fei Yuan, which is, okay, we've seen the big patterns over time, but how can we most effectively help girls to gain an education and to get the most of that education? Most out of that education. So I'll just give a little bit of the sense of why we did this study. So, obviously, again, girls' education is trumpeted. We see high returns from girls' education from a number of studies from all over the world. And one of the things that's striking, though, as I went through syntheses, so reviews of what's the best, what are the best investments for girls' education? What all of those reviews did was they looked at studies of girls' education. Now that makes sense, right? Now, but at the same time, you could imagine that the best investment for girls' education might not actually be an intervention that is targeted specifically to girls, right? And so you can imagine, for example, that a girls' scholarship program might be great for girls' school access, a special teacher training or teacher professional development program that helps sensitize teachers to the differences between girls' and boys' pedagogical or learning styles might be useful. You could also imagine a scenario in a very low-performing education system that where an intervention that is just improves the quality of education overall might be more effective. So we actually found an example of this. So this is just an example to motivate this work. So a girls' scholarship program in Kenya had sizable impacts on girls' learning. In fact, it was kind of a cool program because even though they were girls' scholarships, they also had sizable impacts on boys' education. So girls doing better in school actually led to boys doing better in school as well. There were these positive spillover effects. So that was exciting. And then, so that was in Kenya. So then another program in Bangladesh just helped schools set up parent-teacher conferences. So meetings between parents and teachers to discuss how their kids were doing, how their kids could do better. And that program obviously wasn't gender targeted at all. And it led to much larger gains in girls' learning than the scholarships targeted to girls in Kenya. So it's just an example that a program that isn't targeted to girls could conceivably, in some contexts, lead to bigger gains. So we thought it was important, if we want to know how to help with girls' education, we need to look at the full array of interventions, both those that are targeted to girls and those that aren't targeted to girls. And at the end, I'll talk a little bit about how we might decide, at which times we want different kinds of programs, targeted and non-targeted. So what we did was we went through a database of educational interventions with either learning or access outcomes. So we want to figure out both access, how to make sure girls are in school, and learning, how to make sure they're learning once they're at school. So we looked at all these studies. So 128 of those studies already reported differentiated gender impacts, right? So some of them were targeted towards girls, a lot of them weren't, but many of the ones that weren't had some table, table 14B in the back of the paper that reported the differential impacts for boys versus for girls. And then there were a bunch of studies that didn't report that. So we reached out to the authors of all those studies and we said, hey, can you either send us your data? Not very many authors did that, although a couple had their data posted on the internet. So if you're a researcher and you post your data on the internet, good job, well done. I'll say Pascaline Dupas, who, if you work in this field, you probably know her work. She did the Kenya Scholarship Study with Michael Kramer and Esther Duflo. She was one of the ones who wrote back to us, was like, hey, the data's on the internet, just go for it, knock yourselves out. So best practice. Anyway, and for other authors, we wrote and we said, hey, you don't have to send us your data. Can you run this one additional regression? Just run it for boys and for girls and send us your regression table. And many authors did that. So we found 52 additional studies where authors were willing to do this and provide these additional data. So the first question we asked was, are girl-targeted interventions the most effective interventions for helping girls? So the first question we ask is for access. So what these figures show us are the distribution of effect sizes. And so, for example, across general interventions, so interventions that are not targeted specifically to girls, and then girl-targeted interventions specifically. And so what you can see if you look at the whole distribution of effects, so basically looking at all the general interventions, one of them increases girls' enrollment by 0.2 standard deviation and one of them by 0.1 standard deviation. If you look at that whole distribution of effects, you can see that the 50th percentile, so this is in the figure and it's also in the table below, the 50th percentile is 0.07 standard deviations. You can see that for girl-targeted interventions on access, the 50th percentile is 0.04 standard deviations. So basically these are very similar. And there's no statistically significant difference between these two, right? If you go to the top of the distribution, you say, look, I don't care about the whole distribution of impacts. I just care about the best interventions. If you look at the most effective, the 90th percentile of general interventions, you can see the 90th percentile is almost 0.3 standard deviations. And the 90th percentile for girl-targeted interventions is 0.34 standard deviations. So those are, again, very similar. not statistically significantly different. Down at the bottom, I mean, nobody wants to invest in the worst interventions for girls' education. At least I strongly recommend against it. But you can see these the distribution is very similar also at the other end of the distribution. So basically, we see slightly larger variation for across girl-targeted interventions, but the average impacts are very similar. For learning, we see a similar pattern. The average impact is very similar. So the distribution is 0.12, so slightly larger. Standard deviations for general interventions, and 0.13 for targeted interventions. And if you look at the top of the distribution, we see some large interventions, so 0.5 standard deviations for general interventions, 0.43 for girl targeted interventions. And just to be clear, all of these impacts that we're looking at, the impacts on girls specifically. So you can see, again, this is a very similar distribution. If anything, at the top of the distribution for learning, we have slightly larger impacts for general interventions. So none of these differences are statistically significant. So for learning, the results are the same. Also, if we only compare interventions for similar types of tests, right? So when you're testing learning, if you're testing a very basic literacy skill like letter recognition, can you recognize this letter? What people who work in this field know is that it's relatively easy to get big gains in a letter recognition test. It can be hard to get gains in a full comprehensive literacy test. Even if we just compare interventions with very similar types of tests, we see the same pattern. So the first takeaway from this work is that general interventions can be just as effective for girls as girl-targeted interventions. And they include boys. And the reason I include this caveat is that politically, in a lot of contexts, there's a lot of pressure on politicians to invest in programs that benefit both girls and boys. And so a lot of that is because in democratic states, voters have both sons and daughters. I have 3 kids. I have sons and a daughter. And so I'm interested in performance on both of those parameters. And a lot of voters care about that. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't invest in girl-targeted interventions, but what it does mean is that if there's pressure to invest in interventions that benefit both girls and boys, that it's possible to invest in interventions that really benefit girls a lot while not excluding boys. So the other thing to note on that is that in terms of if you're a policymaker, just thinking about, okay, well, what's my menu of options? Well, there are more tested successful interventions among the general interventions. So if you look at access, for example, across general interventions, and if we use 0.2 standard deviations as the cutoff for an effective intervention, we can see there are, about 32 effective interventions, so 0.2 or larger in the general interventions. And in the girl target interventions, there are 9 interventions with a 0.2 standard deviation size or larger. So we should use both sets of interventions, but we have a larger menu to draw on from these general interventions. Which is all to say that policymakers and partners have a large menu to draw from to support girls in their education, and they should make sure to use both the targeted and the non-targeted interventions. Use the whole menu. So the other point the other thing I'll mention, one of the concerns that comes up that we also had in this work is whether or not general interventions increase inequality. So we showed that general interventions improve, girls' education. But what about that gender gap I just spent 20 minutes talking about? So what we find is that on average, if you look just at the general interventions, the impacts, if anything, tend to be slightly larger for girls. And so if anything, they tend to reduce inequality rather than increase inequality. On average, the effects tend to be the same. So it's not a big reduction in inequality. But one concern is that general interventions might exacerbate inequality and widen those gaps. We don't observe that. So the last thing I'll say is we look at the top 10 interventions for expanding access to girls' education. We also looked, I'm not going to show them on this slide, but we looked at the bottom 10 interventions for expanding access to make sure they weren't the same kinds of interventions. That would obviously be problematic. So what you can see is amongst these top 10 interventions for expanding access to girls' education, 3 of those interventions are girl-targeted. Those are the interventions in red. conditional cash transfers to school girls in Malawi, water and sanitation intervention in Kenya, and private school subsidies for girls in Pakistan. So those are three that all are among the top 10 interventions for increasing access for girls. So a lot of these interventions are just about reducing the cost of schooling. Now, to be clear, when you look at the bottom 10 interventions for expanding access, you also see a few interventions that reduce the cost of schooling there as well, but there are fewer. So it's not that a conditional cash transfer or a cash transfer is a guarantee to, lead to a dramatic boost. There are a lot of other factors that come in that, mediate the impact of a given intervention. But on average, reducing the cost is a pretty good bet for getting girls in school. Another notable finding is that, for expanding access, a lot of the most effective interventions are interventions that work through the household rather than the school. And so the binding constraint in many countries is a household budget constraint that, they just don't have the resources either to pay school fees in some cases, or in other cases, they feel like they don't have the resource to send their girls to school. And so they need to keep their girls at home to work. So the opportunity cost of sending those girls to school. So if we want to improve girls' access to school, the first finding from this work is that we need to cut the cost. If we look at the top 10 interventions for expanding learning in girls' education, what we see is that none of these are girl-targeted interventions. Now, to be fair, the number of interventions that are specifically focused on increasing learning, so pedagogical interventions that are gender-targeted, is relatively limited. So there's a lot of room still to learn in this field. But if we look at the tested interventions, very few of the, none of the top interventions are girl targeted. So what we also see here is if we just say, okay, well, what are our best bets for increasing girls' education? We see lots of pedagogical interventions here. And so, multifaceted literacy intervention in South Africa, a mother tongue instruction intervention in Kenya, an intervention in India that help teachers to reach children at the level of education that they're actually reaching, a holistic, multifaceted literacy intervention in Kenya. These were all sort of among the largest. Obviously, there's the public-private partnership program that was evaluated in Sindh province in Pakistan by Barrero Osorio and others, was also one of the highly effective programs. You can see there are a couple of, so people are always excited about computer-assisted learning. I find, especially in the policy world over the years, especially when I was at the World Bank, I spent a lot of time talking to policymakers, and they all want to, there's some tech executive that has convinced the policymaker, like, oh, this software is going to revolutionize your education system. So there are a couple of software programs, one in Mexico, one in Chile, that do show large impacts. If you look at the bottom 10 interventions for expanding learning, so the least effective interventions for expanding learning, we also have a bunch of computer-assisted learning programs in that pile. And so the answer is not that computer-assisted learning programs are on average a good bet or a bad bet. It's that they are wildly varied. And so, one has to be very cautious and think about, okay, what constraint are we actually relaxing? What problem are we overcoming with this computer-assisted learning? And is it likely to work in this context? So if we want, excuse me, if we want to improve girls' learning in school, our best bet based on the evidence to date is to improve the quality of the pedagogy for all students. And that'll give us the biggest gains for girls as well.
All right, so, David, we have about 5 minutes left.
Yeah, perfect. I'm just wrapping up. Thank you so much. So just the last thing I want to say is a little bit of a framework of how to think about this. So, it might be tempting to walk away from this work and say, oh, great, we don't need to, we don't need to worry about girl-targeted programs at all, or or something like that. So there are a lot of obstacles to girls' education. There are direct costs where you actually have to pay for schooling. There are indirect costs, so the opportunity cost of not providing childcare at home or working. Low quality teaching is an obstacle. Why send my kid to school? Cultural norms and stereotypes, violence and security, poor school infrastructure, the distance, early marriage and pregnancy. These are all obstacles to girls' education. Many of these obstacles are felt by boys as well, not all of them. And so, for example, and this is a deeply kind of just conceptual, if you sort of think through, okay, and this will vary from context to context, but like direct costs, actually having to pay for school, that's likely to affect both girls and boys. So we put that on in red for the girls and the boys. Indirect costs might as well. And, in some countries, there are strong childcare demands for girls and there are market work demands for boys. Low quality of teaching and poor school infrastructure are likely to affect both. Cultural norms and stereotypes often affect girls disproportionately. Early marriage and pregnancy affect girls disproportionately. Violence and security concerns often affect girls disproportionately, although in some contexts, a recent study from Jamaica showed real concerns about boys going to school and gang violence. And so whether we think about general interventions or girl-targeted interventions often depends on which obstacle a school system is facing. And so if a school system, if the principal issue is costs, like we saw in in a number of our studies, simply reducing the cost is highly beneficial to girls, also beneficial to boys. If the chief obstacles are cultural norms or violence and security or distance to school that especially affects girls, in that case, then a girl-targeted interventions like bicycles to school, bicycles for girls in secondary school in India was highly effective. That might be the most effective. And so the key here is to draw on the whole menu of interventions to improve education for girls, both targeted interventions and general interventions. The last thing I'll say is that girls' education by itself isn't enough. So this goes back to the work that I did with Maria Machmal and Pam Jakila. So this looks at the gender gap, the change in the gender gap in years of education over time between 1960 and 2010, and then the gender gap in the labor force participation over that same time period. And what we might have expected to see if there were a strong link between these two is a vertical line going up. And what we see is no relationship. Basically, that as the gender gap closes in education, we see no clear link with the gender gap closing in labor force participation. Does that mean that education doesn't matter for economic outcomes? Not at all. What it does mean is that education by itself, in the absence of labor market opportunities for women, in the absence of cultural norms that allow women to work, in the absence of education that actually prepares people for the world that they're going into, that education by itself is not going to solve our economic inequality problems. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. This was such a fantastic summary of a lot of important results. I'm going to start, we have a couple of questions, so I'm going to jump in immediately. I'll ask people to unmute. If you can't unmute, then let me know, I'll ask your question for you. But some people who've just raised your hand, I don't know what your question is. I'm going to start with Jean-Francois Trani. If you have now been allowed to unmute yourself, if you can please ask your question. No? Okay, so let me just go to.
You're still muted, it looks like.
Yeah. Okay, so let me go to the next question. We'll come back to this. Mr. Kamran Azim, if you could ask your question. Okay, I'll ask this question. If you look at the gap decreasing in some countries, he says it's surprising that the gap is decreasing and as male ratio is also decreasing. What might be the reason of that?
Sorry, what's the male ratio in this context?
So this is the male student ratio. He's saying this is, I think, the first part of your presentation, that if you look at the gender gap, this is decreasing at the same time that the male student ratio might also be going down, the attendance rate, etc. So is there a particular reason for that?
Right. So in fact, I would propose that we actually see, that a lot of the decrease, most of the narrowing of the gender gap often takes place while male education is still increasing. And so in the one figure that I showed, where I just showed an example of 4 countries, and we showed this gap narrowing over time. It was narrowing if you showed this very scientific figure that I'm going to show you with my hands. If you show, so you actually saw a continual rising of male education even as female education was rising more rapidly. So this gap was narrowing. So we actually see it's not that countries stop investing or that households stop investing in boys' education. That continues to rise. But we see is that as male education reaches a certain level, then female education starts to rise significantly more rapidly and catch up. And so it's interesting. The gains for men continue. Most countries still haven't leveled off, at least in our sample of mostly middle-income and low-income countries. But the gains for women tend to be even more rapid.
So there are a couple of questions on heterogeneity that I'm just going to summarize, and this is by Mehreen Mahmood and also Jean-Francois. They're asking about heterogeneity by caste, ethnicity, religious minority, and again, going back to earlier, that aspect of
co-education. So this is a great point. So if we're thinking about the second study about what are the most effective interventions, one of the things that's striking is we found a total of of just under 200 interventions. What that means is that we don't have a large enough sample size to do a full impact analysis of, okay, well, what are the variation by, for example, ethnicity, like you say, caste, this full range of categories. What we do see, for example, is that there is definite heterogeneity. So let me give an example, and this definitely depends on the obstacles. So many of you will be familiar with, and for those of you who aren't, there was a study a couple years ago that showed that distributing bicycles to schoolgirls in India, girls in secondary school, significantly boosted secondary school completion for these girls. And so there was a serious constraint in this context that because of the distance and families didn't feel safe sending their girls to secondary schools, distributing bicycles actually, let girls get back and forth more safely, more quickly, and there was a dramatic improvement. So recently, another research team implemented a very similar program in Zambia, and those results are just recently out. And they showed some small gains of distributing the bicycles, but much smaller, and it didn't affect the dropout rate. It didn't affect the completion rate. It did improve attendance a little bit. So in this context, in Zambia, there was much less of a safety concern with girls getting to and from school than there was in the context in India where this was measured. And so because, the obstacle was different, the cultural norms were different, the threats were different, the same intervention, didn't work. We saw, you see real heterogeneity across this program. And you can see another example with cash transfer programs. This is why we see cash transfer programs both as the most effective interventions, and we see them among the least effective interventions. The reason is that in some contexts, for some income groups, for some castes, there may be a serious financial constraint in getting their kids to school, or a serious financial sacrifice in not having the kids working. Whereas, in other, contexts, that might be much less of an issue. And so that's why, giving a cash transfer that's conditional on schooling in some contexts can make a huge difference. In other contexts, it's not the most effective intervention. So while I can't say, I can't point to here's the most effective intervention for, this, specific, context, caste, we do see a lot of heterogeneity. And this goes back to, I'll just say, the last thing I'll say on this, there's a really nice paper by Bates and Glenerster that talks about how you think about transferring an intervention, an effective intervention from one context to another. And rather than just looking at what are the most effective interventions and going ahead and transporting those to another place that might have a very different context, instead you really have to look at okay, what is this intervention doing? What obstacle is it overcoming? Does that same obstacle exist in this other context? Do we have evidence that suggests that if we overcome this obstacle in this context, that it'll boost learning or boost access? And so there's a whole process that we have to go through if we really want to think about this heterogeneity from context to context. Thanks.
Thank you. I think Jean-Francois is now unmuted. If you could please ask the question.
Thank you so much. The second one, or
the second one?
Because we do. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much for a great couple of presentations. Raised a lot of new ideas for more work on girls' education or on education in general. I wanted to know, I'm not, well, I used to be an economist, but I'm not anymore. I'm in public health. And one of the things is that we believe that combination of interventions can be effective, but we also know that economists particularly do not like that so much because of the difficulties to evaluate them and to understand how to disentangle those actions, especially when the number is such that you can't have so many arms in the trial or the experiment. And so what is your take on that, and what do you think is feasible in terms of combining multiple interventions that maybe singularly have been proven to be effective, and what are the conditions to you think that warrant such a combination?
Thank you for that question, Jean-Francois, and congratulations on moving beyond economics into public health. So this is a great point. So it is true. So I think there's a distinction here between the social science research and the policy research, which obviously they interweave a lot. But from a social science perspective, it's true that economists really like to evaluate individual interventions, right? Because they want to say, okay, well, what's doing the work here? Which specific constraint are we overcoming, right? Which specific obstacle? And if we have like a whole group of interventions, then it's we have no idea which of those things which was most important, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that said, and so that's why I think if you look at randomized controlled trials implemented by economists, many of them, maybe most of them, tend to evaluate one intervention at a time, and some of the best ones will evaluate one arm, another arm, and then combine them, right? So there's a recent study from Tanzania that looks at grants for schools, providing grants so schools have a little more discretionary funding, and performance pay for teachers. And the grants for schools had no effect by themselves. The performance pay for teachers had sort of inconsistent but positive effects. But then they had another group where they combined the two, and they found consistent, strong effects when they put those two together. So that's a nice example of how to test those if one has the sample size and the resources to do that. The other thing so I just finished a review. This paper is going to come out in the next week or two, reviewing research on education in Africa from the last 5 years. So everything I could find, and together with my colleague Amina Mendes Acosta. But what we found was that some of the most promising interventions in most recent years are multifaceted literacy interventions. So literacy interventions that include teacher training, teacher guidebooks, new student textbooks and guidebooks, supervision for teachers. So this whole package of interventions, and putting those all together, we see some of the largest gains in literacy that we've seen from anything. And so that certainly suggested that that in a lot of cases, we really do need a combination of interventions. I think the key there is that we just want to make sure that these are theoretically grounded, right? So there's a temptation sometimes, when I was at the World Bank, we worked with governments to evaluate. And, there are a lot of reasons that governments throw policies together. And so sometimes you have a mishmash of policies that there isn't really a great rational, logical reason for them all to be together. It's just there were different political constraints. I think the best things for us to test are combinations where we say, okay, this is the optimal combination from everything we know, exactly like you said, Jean-Francois, everything that we know about, the best way to keep girls in school. If, in a given context, we know that they both need access, better transportation, better latrine infrastructure at school, a variety of other interventions, then we need to put those together and evaluate them. And if we have the possibility to also evaluate the component parts individually, great. But if not, we just need to evaluate our best package for improving girls' education.
Okay.
Okay, Jannat Khan, I think you're already unmuted, if you can ask.
Okay, thank you so much for such a good presentation. So what I would like to ask is there's a lot of debate recently on how globally we're going through a learning crisis. In fact, Dr. Lan Pritchett has also been talking about this, how, putting children inside of schools does not necessarily equate to them learning, right? So I wanted to ask, what do you think are kinds of curriculums and learning goals, perhaps even pedagogical practices that should be in place if reducing the education gap goal is to empower women? Because just learning gains in different systems would not definitely lead to this goal being fulfilled. In fact, because of non-inclusive curriculums in some countries, including my own, where there's a lot of subliminal messaging in textbooks, sometimes education systems may be used to indoctrinate women, thereby killing that goal in itself. So I would like you to comment on that. Second question, I'll just quickly ask. You talked about the general interventions being more successful in with respect to girl-targeted interventions in some places. Could this be because since the general interventions are targeting both girls and boys, the impact on boys has spillover effects as well?
Those are great questions. Thank you for that, Janat. So two things on your first question about what do we think about in terms of education that's really going to economically empower women. So we don't have a lot of studies on this, to be honest. I think it's a great point that schools, in addition to providing learning, they propagate social norms, and those can be bad norms like gender unequal norms, or they can be good norms. There's a nice new study from Seema Jayachandran and others that looks at a training program for primary school kids on a sort of gender norms training program in schools in India that finds positive impacts in people's stated beliefs and in the chores that boys do at home, like more likely to help out with chores. At least that's what they say. And so that's a little bit of promising. We also have a generation of research. Some of this work from Bangladesh, a lot of it out of different African countries, Uganda, Liberia, that shows that in secondary school, so junior secondary school, for example, having complementary programs like girls clubs that give girls a chance to both learn schools and to have a safe space after school where they're hanging out without boys bothering them and learning new skills and things, that these can be incredibly effective. They can boost girls' incomes afterwards. There's some nice recent work out of Sierra Leone that shows that the existence of those girls' clubs, there was a program going on, and then it was interrupted by the Ebola crisis. And the girls who had been in those girls' clubs before the Ebola crisis struck actually were able to avoid the big increase in adolescent pregnancy and school dropout that came in other communities. And so these complementary interventions that can help strengthen the effect of schooling by giving girls other kinds of skills. So that's kind of the direction that I would point there. Oh, and I forgot the second question. What was the second question?
So the second question was just asking you whether the fact that general interventions do better than girl-targeted interventions is because there are positive spillovers from the boys that perhaps, impact girls as well. Those who aren't,
right, so,
direct beneficiaries of the program. Could that
right.
be a reason?
So that's a great question. And it is tough to know. We can't know specifically from our research. So, a study that I mentioned early on is a girl scholarship program in Kenya by Duflo, Dupas, and Kramer. And in that study, the only people who could win the scholarships were girls. And they said, well, what's the impact of offering these scholarships, the promise of a merit-based scholarship? And they found that girls did better, and they found that boys did better as well. Now, the boys were not responding to the scholarship, right? They were just in an environment where people were working harder in school, and there was kind of a competitive environment. And even though the boys were totally ineligible, we see this positive spillover impact on boys. And so I would expect, and again, I haven't seen good evidence on this, but I would expect that we would see the same kinds of impacts going the other way, so that in co-educational settings where girls and boys are educated together, if interventions are helping boys, if they're fostering an environment where there's more learning, then everybody gets, can get caught up in that, right? There are classrooms that have a spirit of learning in them, and the more people who are engaged in that, the more positive impacts there are on others. So I certainly believe that there are those spillover effects. Besides that Kenya study going from girls to boys, I haven't seen good evidence of it going the other way.
Okay, we have a few more questions, but so I'll have one more live question because I'm conscious we've run out of time, and then maybe I can summarize the rest of them and ask them at the end. So for now, Dr. Mozam, if you can unmute and please ask your question.
Thank you, Farah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hello. Oops.
I'm sorry, you're cutting in and out.
Thank you. Sorry, I realize, yes, time's running out. David, thank you very much. I think yours is a very good meta study. And I think we need a lot more meta studies which are able to look at all the other studies and then derive a general policy implication as well as some causality. But since I don't have enough time to praise your study, let me just get to the question, which is that when you're trying to explain gender gaps and you're looking at the causality, I would suggest looking at gender gaps in other areas. Now, I know you do that with the labor force participation rate, but you looked at it as a policy implication. That is, do reducing gender gaps in education reduce gender gaps in labor force participation? But I would urge, if I may, trying to put it as a causal variable, because we did a study for UN Women within the UN system many years ago, where we found that gender gaps in other areas such as labor force participation, in poverty, in nutrition, tended to influence gender gaps in education. And I think that might be useful. Of course, that will mean that you will have to split it up by age cohorts, because labor force participation, for example, would affect upper age cohorts rather than lower age cohorts, etc. Thanks.
I'll just say that's a great comment, and in line with the earlier question. And if you have that study that you did many years ago, feel free to email it to me. It's easy to find my email on the internet. But I think that's exactly right. And in this question that came up earlier, and also came up from the reviewer, why we see the turning point in gender gaps at different years. We think that it's highly likely that it has to do with expansions of rights or the narrowing of gaps in other areas. And so trying to get it, using that exactly as you say, as a potential causal explanation is a great way forward. And we're definitely going to look at that. Thank you.
Thank you.
David, if you have like 2 more minutes, can I ask? Because there are actually a couple of questions here. So Sabine Yunus, if you can now unmute and ask your question.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I'm Sabine. I'm from PPF. Thank you so much for this detailed information. And this is my favorite topic. I also did some research on this topic, like what works in girls' education. So according to my analysis or I did literature review on this topic. According to that, I think that combination of things works. Like if we can provide better facilities for the girls in school, like good toilets, some support for MHM for menstruation health and transportation, and the female teacher, that combination, and support from the parents and community. So that combination really works for the girls' education. And the most important for that is the female teacher. I asked that question, but what do you say about the other things? Like if there's a boundary wall, girls are more tend to go to schools. And some other, if there's a good furniture, the good environment. So what do you say about that?
Farah, should I answer, or were you going to collect a couple?
I can collect a couple. I see a number of them on the same theme, which are about mostly on social norms. I know you talked about it briefly, but there are some specific questions on whether you have any insights from literature on specific norms to target, particularly in the developing world context that could work in this aspect. And there are a number of questions, going on from the question that Sabine just asked about female teachers, that sometimes they're not available, sometimes they are, but they're not very satisfied at their work. And so what are some of the obstacles faced on that aspect as well?
Okay, thank you for all those. So on Sabine's question about the combination of factors, it's a great point. We don't have a lot of studies that actually evaluate this combination of factors. And so, we can say, okay, this was effective here, this was effective there. And I think from a policy perspective, it makes sense to say, okay, let's combine these. So, we do see an impact of female teachers in some contexts. In West Africa, we see that less strongly. So we've done some analysis there. There are some good studies, though, out of Korea, for example, that show a strong positive impact of female teachers, especially as kids get to middle school. So it seems like female teachers may matter more. And there's one other country that had a study like that shows that female teachers may matter more for girls. And this is perhaps unsurprising as we get to lower secondary or upper secondary school. And then there are other programs, like providing menstrual materials, for example. There was an intervention in Nepal that didn't show big impacts of that. There's a recent study out of Kenya that did show pretty sizable impacts of that. So, we don't have essentially any studies besides one WASH study that show kind of, okay, what happens when you put all of these things together? And so I think that's an area where we definitely need more research is, okay, what's the impact of this collection of interventions to keep girls in secondary school, for example? In terms of social norms, so this is a little bit less in my area of expertise, I should say. And so obviously the social norms that are going to be combated in each context will be different. There's some really nice work by Erin Murphy-Graham and Cynthia Lloyd. So that says, okay, here's a framework for what education needs to look like to be effective for women's economic empowerment, including what social norms need to change. Obviously, norms about whether or not it's appropriate for girls to work in the market, in the economic marketplace, and about sort of equality of genders. So those are kind of the most obvious ones. But again, I'd point to this nice work by Murphy, Graham, and Lloyd on this work for more of that. And then for female teachers, and I'm happy to share this with Farah later if she wants to share, we do have this summary piece that we wrote on the impact of female teachers. There's some promising evidence on this. It seems like in the lower grades in primary school, it seems less important, which is ironic because usually female teachers are more common in primary school and less common when you get to secondary school, which is where we see the biggest gains. Part of that also, we see in a few studies, significant impacts of secondary school female teachers on aspirations of young women. So not just on learning, but also, they see a woman science teacher and girls realize they can be a scientist or a mathematician. And so there are real impacts there. Obviously, as someone highlighted, there are long-term investments that have to be made in order to have, a good core of female secondary school science teachers. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to, I think, use my moderator privileges and the discussion now. I think we've taken up a lot of your time. We will have these questions. I will send them to you. A lot of them have to do with, I think they're very encouraging to see a lot of young researchers also here who are trying to get more material to study from. And so maybe we can, you can guide them on that. So thank you again for your time. We've taken a lot of it, but we really appreciate it. We really like, we really appreciate the nicely summarized wealth of information that you've just given us. And thank you also to our audience who've joined us today. I hope to see you again next week. We will have Dr. Kate Wyborney, who's going to be talking about the effect of using religious personalities for COVID messaging in Pakistan. And we will be sharing the links with you soon. I think the link should also be in the chat section today. But in any case, we'll send it to you very soon. Thank you, and take care, and see you all